This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions shared are mine and my guests alone and don't represent our employers, past, present, or future. Medicine is always evolving and practices may vary. Nothing here should be taken as medical advice. Always follow your own professional judgment and institutional guidelines.
This story, all the different aspects of it, to me, never felt so much like medical history or Black history, but simply American history. And I think when you read this, what you see is that everything is a collective effort. Does Freedom House become Freedom House without Peter Safar? No. Does Peter Safar's idea become Freedom House, the people up the hill? No. But they come together and they create this incredible thing. People from different worlds with a collective goal and understanding that, hey, all we need to do, get where we want to be, is to pull on the same oar.
Welcome to the Beyond the Call Light podcast with Gary, the ER nurse, where we tackle the tough topics in nursing. Update your whiteboards and huddle up because this episode begins now.
Hey, it's Gary the ER Nurse. Welcome back to the Beyond the Call Light podcast. We took a little bit of a break, but we're back now, and I'm really excited for our very first guest of 2026, and that is author Kevin Hazzard. He's written several books, including the one that we're going to talk primarily about today, which is American Sirens, which is based on the Freedom House in Pittsburgh, the country's first paramedic agency. And then he's also written a book, which predates that, 1,000 Naked Strangers, based on his time as a paramedic in Atlanta. And he's got a new book coming out. We'll talk about that. It actually came out last month in March, so we'll talk about that as well. But first, I would like to allow Kevin the opportunity to kind of introduce himself and give a little bit of a background about him and his career so far.
Hey, man. Appreciate it, Gary. So, you covered the basics right there. I started working as a paramedic in, let's see, 2003. Was following, I kind of got into it following 9/11. Spent about a decade there, got out, and then, as a way of sort of processing this very strange decade that I had, I started writing. And, that effort turned into 1,000 Naked Strangers. And that sort of opened the door to Sirens, which, more or less led to our, new book. But yeah, I've just kind of been around the emergency medicine world for a while now.
Like, did you have any journalism aspirations when you were younger?
I always wanted to be a writer. And, I was kind of doing that from the time I was a kid. Got out of college, started writing for magazines, was a daily reporter at a newspaper. Was kind of in that, again, until 9/11, when I sort of inspired to be part of something else and be part of the sort of collective, which is what led me to EMS. But, that there are people who do that their entire lives. But from my perspective, that was one of those jobs that you do when you're young. And at some point, it has run its cycle. And by my early 30s, when you're having kids, I could tell, for me at least, it had run its cycle.
Now, I've seen your bio, and you're writing for TV shows, including, I understand, Code Black. You've written for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen? Now, have you? I know the TV show. I've not seen the TV show. I've seen clips of it, but I watched the documentary Code Black. Have you seen the documentary Code Black?
Yeah, I saw that first before when it first came out. Actually, we were living in LA, and I watched it and was blown away. It was so good. And having worked at Grady, I really, I could relate to it very much. Public hospitals in big cities are very similar. The guy who made that documentary, Ryan McGarry, is a friend of mine. He did a great job. I got to know each other while I was writing for Code Black. And, he's a stand-up dude, and he did such a great job with that.
Absolutely did. It's one of my favorite documentaries. I recommend, like, all my nursing students. I'm like, if you can find this documentary and you have any aspirations to do high-level trauma, ER, you need to go watch that. Now, times have changed a little bit. Like that hospital the way they had that set up is not, because they changed, they moved to a newer hospital, and you can kind of see it really change the dynamic of things. It's not quite like that anymore, but I think shows like The Pit, which kind of loosely ties into what we're going to talk about today, kind of like brings that back to the forefront, like how chaotic it can be. And I think that kind of that rolls into one of the reasons I reached out to you is because I had read your book, and then I saw an episode of The Pit, season 1, where they talk about the Freedom House. They had the patient who had some dementia, but recalled his time as a paramedic. And then his family was like, oh, yeah, he was a Freedom House paramedic. And I was like, oh, I remember that. I think I heard an NPR story about it. And so I reached out to you last fall, was really grateful to hear back from you. But let's talk about the Freedom House. Your time as a paramedic. How did you come to hear about the Freedom House story, and what prompted you to kind of like delve a lot deeper into this?
Summer of 2018, I got an email. And I get these every once in a while, thankfully. Somebody will say, hey, man, read Sirens or read Strangers. I related to it, and, it told my story. It helped me tell my family my story, something like that. But this particular email said, hey, man, read the book, enjoyed your story. Do you know this? And it was just like Freedom House in a sentence, basically, which was that there was this ambulance service in Pittsburgh. I had not heard of Freedom House. So I just started Googling it. And, as a journalist, you kind of like, I know what the outlets that would sort of tell this kind of story. So I kept thinking, any moment I'm going to come across a definitive New Yorker or Atlantic piece about this, that sort of, the 10,000 words that tells the story. And it didn't exist. There were all these little tiny bits of like, some of it was, Pitt University's sort of monthly mailer that they send out. It would be a 300-word blurb or something like that. It was a lot of stuff like that. So I thought, man, there's got to be an incredible story here, and nobody's really tackled it in its entirety. So everything I came across, I wrote down every name that was listed, and I just, the reporter and he just did that, and I just started tracking down whatever people I could track down. I came across Safar and the wildness of the CPR stories. I knew John Moon, and sort of like, I didn't know him, but I saw his trajectory to a degree, and I knew something fascinating was there. Mitch Brown, Walt Brown, Darnella, George, all these names pop up, Phil Howland, all these kind of names would pop up. And I just, kept tracking them down one by one. And, each one provided a more fascinating story than the last. It was incredible, and I mean, like, you could write an entire book about Ned. You could write an entire book about Peter Safar. You could take any single human being that's been one shift on a Freedom House ambulance and write an entire book just about them. The neighborhood they grew up in, that in and of itself is worthy of real study and a portrayal. So everything I dug up about this is fascinating. There was no way that this is not a story you could let go of.
I remember when I first heard about this, I kind of felt like you. I started going down the internet rabbit hole, looking for those definitive stories outside of the book, and I didn't find them. How surprised were you when you started learning about all of this and how important it was to the history of paramedicine and pre-hospital care? How surprised were you that there was almost nothing about this out there?
I was surprised I didn't know it, but I wasn't surprised there was nothing out there. If we're just going to be totally candid about it, our history is a lot of this, a lot of burying the past. This is a story that's very easy to bury. The people involved who are really doing this work, they were without agency. And so, the city could scrap it, sweep it under the rug, let it move on. And, the 70s and 80s, 90s, and into pretty recent times, people were okay with moving on from that. So I wasn't shocked, to be honest with you. I was disappointed that my first day in the EMT school, we learned about Napoleon and flying carriages and all that other nonsense. And then at some point, they say, oh, and then there was this television, somebody wrote the white paper, and then along comes Johnny and Roy, and here we are. And, there's a big thing that happens there. And that leap was never been addressed.
I talked to my kids. I told my kids I was going to be doing this interview today, and I was explaining to them what Freedom House was. I've got a 10-year-old who is dead set on joining the rescue squad with me as soon as he turns 16. He's been going since he was 2 years old. And so I was telling him about the history of the Freedom House. And I try to explain to him that EMS, as he knows it today, when he goes and sees all the ambulances and sees the paramedics and the things that we do there, I tell him that's all relatively new. And that has not always been the case. And that Freedom House helped found the national concept of pre-hospital medicine. And I said, there was a time when I was born in the 70s that was not standard of care. Can you kind of paint a picture of what EMS looked like prior to Freedom House?
So there's essentially three different agencies that provide care up through the 1960s, and in some places into the 1970s. You have cops, who, just generally speaking, guys at the end of their career, not terribly well trained, less trained than the lifeguard at a public pool. They don't really have a lot of equipment. They have an old vehicle. They come to your house, they grab you, they toss you in the back, and speed away. The volunteer fire department, which at that time, most fire departments were volunteer. And not a lot of training, not a lot of energy, resources, or focus placed upon it. So it is essentially, we're going to come, we're going to grab you, we're going to toss you, and take off. And then the third is the funeral. And it makes perfect sense to think about the fact that it's the only business with a vehicle that can transport a body. So, you've got these undertakers that are embalming a body of cult. They hop in their hearse, they speed to your house, they toss you in the back. They make a whole lot more money if you die and they do your funeral than if they transport you. So it's the ultimate conflict of interest. It's also just, imagine looking out your front window when you're having a heart attack and what speeds up is a hearse. Like, what about bad omens? Um, but that's what existed. And that's the reason, of course, for the white paper, 1965, when they come forward and say, hey, there's this unchecked epidemic of preventable trauma deaths. And the reason for it is hospital care is either non-existent or useless when it arrives. And so people are dying. Somebody needs to do something. Somebody please do something.
What were conditions like in Pittsburgh? Why Freedom House? Like, of all the places in the country, why was Freedom House, which existed prior to this agency, they were already in existence, but what made Freedom House in Pittsburgh the central figure, like location for this revolution of pre-hospital care?
Two things. The conditions that created the problems in the Hilders were not unique to Pittsburgh. However, they have this, the ultimate spark to their fuse in Peter Safar. So let's just set Safar aside for one quick second. The Hill was going back hundreds of years, it was a minority neighborhood, whether it was new immigrants or ultimately, Black Americans, but nonetheless, it was a minority neighborhood. By the mid 20th century, it becomes predominantly, almost exclusively Black. The city is tons of red lines. Black residents aren't allowed to move out. They're forced to stay here. And then, as was happening in cities all across the country in the mid 20th century, the government, in order to rejuvenate its urban spaces, offers cities money to build infrastructure, build universities, hospitals, highways, civic centers, coliseums, theaters, whatever. And of course, those places are always going to be, or those things are always going to be built in places that the city views to be expendable. And who is more expendable than your Black population in mid 20th century America? And so, a big chunk of the Hill District was torn down, about 2/3 of it, to build a highway and a civic center. And because of existing red line covenants, Black residents are not allowed to move out. So they're forced to stay where they are. 2/3 of the neighborhood has to cram into the remaining 1/3. There are no jobs. There's no opportunity. There's a complete lack of hope. And when you take any population and you strip away hope and opportunity, what happens is desperation, and what follows desperation is crime. So that's where the English is in the 1960s. I mean, it's so you cannot divorce sort of America's various urban slums or ghettos, whatever word you want to use, from the policies that created those things. You have the Great Migration happening in the early 20th century. These people are leaving the South where they're facing horrific conditions, and they're moving into other cities that are forcing them into certain areas that immediately become overcrowded. The utilities are never updated. The opportunities are provided in any kind of way. Like there's no business there. A lot of the like bad sewage systems and bad power and water. Like it's a nightmare, and they're not allowed to leave. Like the government, local governments say you guys are not allowed to live in any neighborhood but this one, and then sort of turn around a decade later and say, "What's the matter with you people? You're living in a friggin' slum." And it's like, well, yeah, you forced us into this slum, and you allowed it to become a slum, and you wouldn't let us leave, and now so here we are. And by the way, we wouldn't have come here in the first place if they weren't lynching us in the South. I mean, the horrible conditions that they were facing. So that is the Hill District in the mid 1960s. So it's a community that has no opportunity. Freedom House was created by a guy by the name of James McCoy, who's a civil rights activist, who said there's got to be a way that people living in this neighborhood employed, and not just servant jobs and gardener jobs. But there has to be a way to train them, train us. We can train ourselves to do real jobs, to do careers. So he's struggling to find something that will like the sort of job that will provide mobility, provide stability to people in the neighborhood. Enter Peter Safar, is this genius physician. Before he dies, he'll be nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Sort of one of the progenitors of um, anesthesia, and the sort of like the modern ICU. He's one of the people who helped to create the modern ICU. He invented CPR in the 1950s, completely by himself. He sees what we're doing, which was terrible, this like really weird mechanical way of breathing. He comes across a study that the rest of the world had ignored, that expired air contains enough oxygen to keep you alive. And he says, okay, on the one hand, stops breathing right now. We basically roll them face down, we press on their back, we flap their arms, and we just hope that something happens. And then on the other hand, you've got a study that says expired air can keep people alive. Marries these two things. He says, I'm going to disprove that this ridiculous, moving method doesn't work. I'm going to prove that rescue breathing does work. So he sets up a series of studies in Baltimore where he gets volunteers, and he says, I'm going to sedate you and then paralyze you. And while you're lying breathless on the floor, I'm going to keep you alive with my unproven method. And by the way, I'm not going to do it, and a doctor's not going to do it, but I'm going to bring in untrained volunteers. I'm going to bring in secretaries and bankers. He brings in 11-year-old kids. Like literally, there's photographs of Boy Scouts. And he does it. He keeps these guys alive. And, the power of persuasion this man must have to convince people to sign up for this study is mind-blowing. Like I can't convince someone to buy a book. This guy is convincing someone to essentially like lie dead on the floor and let a child keep.
And at one point, he had like a Boy Scout doing it, like not even an adult.
No, there's a video of an 11-year-old child doing rescue breathing on a man. I mean, it is wild. If you Google Peter Safar CPR studies, you can find these things. So he releases his studies in the 1950s. The world immediately goes, oh my God, look at this. They embrace CPR. He kind of marries his rescue breathing with chest compressions. He travels around the world teaching this method. In those travels, he comes across Laerdal, who at the time was considered a Norwegian toy maker. He convinces him to make the Resusciani doll. And then, CPR's talk to people around the world. Forever changes how lives are saved. Could have retired, walked away, and been a wild success. Moves to Pittsburgh, starts their ICU at Presbyterian University Hospital, which will eventually become Pitt. While he's there, he has his daughter, young teenager, very bad case of asthma. He and his wife are out of town. She has an asthma attack. People who arrive at her emergency don't know CPR. She dies. He speaks to the hospital. He gets there. He takes over resuscitation efforts on his own child, which I cannot imagine. They get a pulse back. She's ultimately brain dead. She dies. So, he kind of uses this tragedy to create the modern paramedic program, which is, I'm going to truncate med school. I'm going to turn it into a 1-year program where I'm going to teach you only the essentials, like all the cardiology and the seizures and the OB and the trauma and all the things that we do today. He redesigns the ambulance. The idea of a medical director from him, the idea of taking these students, sending them to the ER and the OR and OB and the morgue, all that comes, all the things that you do in paramedic school. This is stuff that he invents. The outside of the ambulance, the inside of the ambulance, what they're going to carry, how they're going to be treated, all of that comes from him. He can't find, however, anyone to take this job because if you think about it, paramedic does not exist. How do you get someone to walk away from their job, from their life for a year, take a really difficult program for a job that doesn't exist? You need someone desperate. And he just happens to have a collection of desperate young men looking for an opportunity. Those two forces marry, and therein is born the modern paramedic. And the interesting thing about it is that because of the conditions in Pittsburgh at the time, Safar's idea is taken and given life by 24 black men from the Hill District.
You're listening to Beyond the Call Light with Gary, the ER nurse. If you like what you're hearing, make sure to follow and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Amazon Music. New episodes drop regularly, and your ratings and reviews help us reach even more listeners across the healthcare community. Now, back to the show. And one of the things when I read the book, and I'm 51 years old, I grew up integrated schools, but I know that 4 years prior to my birth in 1975, Virginia, which is where I live now, had just integrated schools. So that was just 4 years prior to me. I read that book, and when I got to the point where these highly trained men going to save lives in predominantly white neighborhoods were being refused. And I have a hard time, and maybe you can help me, I doubt you can, wrap my mind around that I might be having a heart attack. And there are men that come in here that want to save my life, but because I don't like the color of their skin, I'm going to say, no, I'm good. I don't understand how the human mind can process that information. Now, I know it was a different time, but still, I would choose life over any other, any discrimination that I may have, which I like to think I don't, but I mean, we all have inherent discrimination, but I just cannot wrap my mind around refusing care because somebody has a different skin color than you.
Racism, discrimination, these are odd human diseases. And you just sort of put your finger on the proof that that's precisely what it is. Because, there's that great example in the book of John Noon who's treating a heart attack, and the woman is really hesitant to let them do anything, to let them touch her. And, anyone who's been in medicine knows when it comes to your brain or your heart, so they're trying to explain that to her. And there's this long pause. And the long pause is exactly what you're saying. Explain this to me. The long pause is death or allowing undesirable hands to touch me. That there's a pause gets to the very twisted mythology of hate and fear and discrimination and racism. It is not something you can explain in any way other than that. It is, a disease cannot be explained, at least not logically. And this is kind of where it comes from. And that's what they were facing, and the fact that they were patient enough to do that. I mean, how many of us hearing that would go, you know what? I'll be back in 10 minutes to work your arrest, motherfucker. That's how I would look at it. That's what I would say.
I'm going to be your
I'll
paramedic one way or the other, either now or in 10 minutes.
Fine. You just bought yourself a tube and a whole lot of epi. Doesn't matter to me. So, for them to be able to swallow that and still have enough compassion and decency to say to this woman who had shown them neither of either of those two things, to say, we're here for you. We're going to remain until you can sort of wrap your head around it. It's truly remarkable.
My next question has to do with the technology that came about of the Freedom House. And I think one of the things that really blew my mind, and I think of modern EKGs, the things that I use, I think of those as a relatively new innovation, but they are not. And I mean, I've heard nurses tell me about the suction cup EKGs from, years past. But I think the concept of doing 12 leads in the field at the stage at which they were doing it blew my mind. Can you talk about some of the medical innovations that came out of this Freedom House paramedic agency?
Yeah, I mean, it should be noted that Belfast had a medical or like a cardiac unit that was out in the field. And then, of course, Dr. Nagel down in Miami is sort of like the guy who brings telemetry out to the world. But what Freedom House does, specifically in terms of like EKGs and telemetry and all that, really marry it with a full spectrum emergency medical service. So, they're like every innovation that they come across, they just suck it up and they bring it out to the people. You look at an ambulance, a lot of them were hearse ambulances. A lot of them were paddy wagons or trucks, and Safar, says, okay, we need to find something that really works well because he's an anesthesiologist. That's why there's a captain's chair at the head of the stretcher, and to your immediate right, there's also unit because in his mind it's like airway. But as he's coming up with new ways to design an ambulance, he's going to his medics and saying, okay, what is it that you guys are facing? How can we streamline this, make this as effective and efficient as possible? So you got the design of the how units are dispatched. Again, it's something that like it's a trial and error as these guys are being dispatched around the city and determine, okay, what's the best way to do this. And then again, because Safar's an anesthesiologist, these guys are coming to him and saying, hey, so there's this weird thing going on. These people they're dying of heroin overdoses, and we're having a really hard time to do with it. Can you help us out? And Safar goes, well, yeah, of course. I mean, there's this drug that we use in the OR all the time to bring people out of anesthesia. It's called Narcan. No reason I can't teach you guys how to use it. And you can, it works for every other form of it. Of course, it's going to work for heroin. So here you go. So they're literally the first people to reverse a heroin overdose using Narcan. They pioneer that method, and then it comes out to the rest of us, to the point that now, people have, Narcan dose spritzers in the front of their car in case they stumble across something. And of course, cops all over America are bathing in Narcan every time they hear the word fentanyl. But I guess that's one thing we can. But it's it's all of these kind of innovations. Safar, when he developed CPR, he was non-proprietary. One of the things that he came across was, or that he developed was, it's called the S2. It's sort of an early barrier, mouth to mouth. Again, doesn't patent it, just gives it out for free. Leave medicine should be open source. So any doctor anywhere can just walk into Freedom House and say, what are you guys doing? How can I take this back to my town? So the doctors ride with Freedom House medics. They sit down with Safar. They sit down with the medics. Mitch Brown, one of the early medics who became operations director, incredibly eloquent, just incredibly brilliant man, is able to sit down with people and go, here's what we do. Here's what you need to do. Here's what we found. Didn't work. Here's something that we're struggling with, we're trying to fix. So you're going to hit this. Maybe if you come up with a solution, call us back. Like everything that they're doing, they're just sort of giving to the world. It's the ultimate example of free source medicine. And, unfortunately for them, that favor is not paid back in the end.
Was you kind of talked about some of the key figures, John Moon, Peter Safar. There were a lot of very important figures outside of those two. Who else stuck with you from that book on a personal level?
Just mention Mitch. His story is really incredible. When he's a young kid, his mother has a stroke. He calls for help. The police-borne ambulance service arrives, insists that she's drunk, refuses to take her. He has to beg them. They finally say, okay, but we're not carrying her because we don't carry drunks. So he carries his own mother, lays her in the back of the paddy wagon. She rides by herself, where she sits in a hallway an hour before somebody finally goes, something's not right here. They discover, oh no, this is a stroke, but then it's too late. His mom dies. He goes off to Vietnam, becomes a medic, returns, hears what Safar's trying to do, and joins up. So his entry into this world is sort of an effort to correct the system that killed his mother. Think of Darnella Wilson, who was a young high school graduate, kind of gets taken on as a mascot. Some of the guys knew her older sister, and they bring her along and get her job as a dispatcher. But then because she's so young and she's got this kind of curious personality, they say, hey, if you think maybe this might be for you, we're happy to take you out on these calls and see what you think. And so she is, beginning to awaken to this world. Freedom House is shut down. She has to endure quite a bit in this aftermath. The city sort of takes her, and she winds up essentially as a hall monitor in the city jail, which is a really traumatic experience for her. But she holds on. She gets her medic numbers. She goes on and becomes a nurse, a long career in medicine. So there's just so many. I could go on all day of all these people who came here through these different ways, but who who arrived at this place in time and provided this service to the rest of us that we all were very quick to sort of forget about, move on from, but who sat there and said, we were here, we did this, our contributions matter, and someday you guys are going to remember us.
They were almost forgotten.
Yeah.
Despite, you read this book and you learn about them, you just think, this is incredible. This should be taught in every EMT class, every paramedic class across the country. It's part of the history. When I went to nursing school, we learned nursing history. We learned the key figures in nursing. Despite the success and the innovations that Freedom House came up with, it was ultimately shut down. I've read the book. I know why. But can you kind of talk about the high level overview of what led to that decision to shut down something that was so monumentally successful?
The city had spent years fighting against Freedom House. From its inception, which is 1966, to the doors closed in October of 1975, the city had been resisting. And if you follow the rest of the country and how EMS is progressing, it is not resisting anywhere else. And the only difference between Pittsburgh and Columbus or Jacksonville or Los Angeles or Miami or Chicago or Dallas or New York is that the majority of the people providing the service are Black. And I said in the book, that can be a Rorschach. You stand on racial issues in terms of how you interpret that particular piece of data. So when the city can finally no longer defend its position. When the rest of the country had adopted this, when paramedics are on primetime television every night in a wildly popular TV show, the city finally says, okay, we're going to dump money into ambulance service. But they have no intention of that ambulance service being greenhouse. So, the doctors who created this program and are presently serving as medical directors, the medics who have been on the streets for a decade, they are not consulted, they are not involved, they are not wanted. The city starts brand new with new doctors, new people, new training program, which, by the way, uses a book that was developed by one of Freedom House's medical directors, using the input and the knowledge and the experience of the Freedom House medics, called Emergency Care in the Streets. And it trains their replacements. There's simply no way to interpret that other than the city did not want to be represented on an international stage by its least desirable citizen.
Now, having worked as a paramedic yourself, how did writing this book change your view on your own time in EMS, if it did at all?
I mean, it gave me a greater sense of history. I didn't connect the whole Napoleon thing way too far back. I came up under the generation that was inspired by Johnny and Eagle. I didn't watch Emergency. I don't have the lunchbox. I've never stood in a line of 300 people to get their autographs. So I know a lot of people do, but that was just never this piece of history and understanding it, that kind of gave me a grounding. I always took pride in having done that and enjoyed it, changed my life. But this, for me, added this incredible dimension of, heroism and just the honor of these guys to do what they did.
Do you think that if you had learned about Freedom House prior to your EMS experience, do you think that would have shaped you differently or changed the way you practiced?
I think if we all knew about it, we would have a different view in general of what EMS needs to be. I mean, we're kind of just now coming to the idea of public safety should reflect the community it serves. So I don't know that it would affect me necessarily, but it probably would have affected the demographic makeup of the class. I worked at Brady. We were white, we were black, we were straight, gay. I mean, we had the full spectrum of society, but I know a lot of services like that. Especially fire-based services. A lot of them are, white dudes. So I think if this history was always known and its examples had been taken, I think providers in the rest of the country would probably represent their communities in a much better way.
And your book, 1,000 Naked Strangers, that came out, that was your first book, correct?
Correct.
So that came out before American Sirens, but how did that experience kind of shape your approach to American Sirens? Obviously, having a background in EMS, you probably understood a lot of what they were talking about in terms of the technical aspects of it, but was there anything else that kind of help you better understand the story as part of your EMS experience?
I mean, to know what it feels like to be in those moments was huge. When I was trying to write this book, when I was trying to write Strangers, I was coming at it a few years removed, trying to look back at the beginning. So, it was over a decade from when I began, and it was like, how did I get into these things? So I knew that already it begins to fade and is difficult to access. When I began interviewing people for Sirens, these guys are decades removed and, whole careers, whole life taking place. So I knew I had to find ways to access those early days that that clearly hadn't been in quite some time. And so, having been a medic, I know what it's like in your first day to walk out and, that imposter syndrome, just like full on fear. And so when John was describing his first day, I just kind of stopped him. I was like, "Hey, man, like you had to be terrified. There's a literally one of his first calls was to a house fire into which a woman is terribly burned. And if you have done it, you know what it is like to have someone, the first time a critical patient is placed in your hands, you know that feeling." And so I was able to kind of that and got a much better picture of what was going through his mind, his partner's mind, and how that progressed. And I think he was able to be a little bit vulnerable with me and admit they made a mistake because I understood, was able to make him feel comfortable and like not judged, but just because the outside world thinks like, well, you guys are, they have that weird like hero thing or like tough guy rescue thing where they, if you admit that, man, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I in my pants and I was telling my partner like, drive, drive. Um, you know, like people who sit down and watch 911, they would never understand that. And they'd be like, "Oh, well, you're not not realizing that's how we all begin."
Quick break from the conversation. If you're enjoying Beyond the Call Light, please don't forget to follow the show wherever you listen. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Amazon Music. Hit that follow or subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. And if you're on Apple or Spotify, a quick rating or review really helps others find the show. Speaking of which, let's get back to it. What lessons from like today's EMS providers should today's EMS providers take from the Freedom House? Like what core principle that was developed from Freedom House can we integrate into the EMS system today?
When I hear these guys ask this question, the main thing that they come back over and over and over again is that the provider has to reflect the community. I think when we've all worked for systems where people are not patients treated well, and I think a lot of that comes from a disconnect, lack of empathy, people coming from two different worlds, and that creates a sense oftentimes in providers of like, oh, these people are X because of this, and I think if everybody, if your partner maybe grew up there or his family that grew up there, you're probably less likely to come in talking a whole lot of shit about them because the guy sitting next to you, has a personal connection, wherever that might be. If you're in rural Georgia, those people that that like that sort of frequent flyer population is going to be white people living in trailers. If you're downtown Atlanta, it's going to be black people living in projects. It can be anybody. You have no connection to those people, no understanding. How empathetic you can be, or at least how long will that empathy last through the years? Like one difficult patient after another, and you get chewed out, and you see people who very often are architects of their own demise. How do you still, you know, hold them in like a caring place? I have empathy for you, treat you with decency. I may not agree with your lifestyle, and I may be able to sort of look back and say, okay, some of these problems are self-inflicted, but nonetheless, here you are. And it's my job simply to help you out and to bring you into whatever's coming next. I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to see people as humans and not just as, the 11th run of the.
I think that the challenge there is empathy. Can that be taught or learned, or is that something that people have inherently in their DNA?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think it needs to be reinforced. The most empathetic person in the world can lose empathy. Firsthand experience. I know what it's like to be burned out and, work at a high volume system where you're running, 10 calls in a 13-hour shift and you're just going all night long. exhausted and you're worn out. And it's really easy to just go, man, like enough of you. And it needs to be reinforced, which again is culture, and culture comes down to.
Now, there's been a lot, and I don't know if it's because I've read the book and I've done a lot of searching on it. You know how they monitor everything that we search and they feed our algorithm based on the things that we're talking about and looking up on the internet. But I feel like I've seen a lot more positive publicity and recognition coming to the Freedom House. Recognition, whether it's like a local legislation or state legislation or federal legislation where they're recognizing them. I mean, obviously that's got to feel good that they're, even though it's way overdue, that you're starting to see more of this recognition coming forward.
It's incredible. I mean, to be a part of it, to help push that rock a little bit, because when I showed up, they were on the hill. They were pushing the boulder. And, I was simply one of the people who came along and stepped in and said, "Hey, I'll help you for a little while." So whatever has happened since then, whatever I was able to contribute, I was contributing to an ongoing effort. So to see, and I think some of it is timing. This book came out in '92. Would the world be ready? Probably not. I think it would have been seen differently. So there's a recognition out, there's an understanding. And, two logical people can look at the same problem and say like, hey, here's the cause, and perhaps here's the solution. And, we've kind of come to that place with this particular story. And so, it's a like a mix of, somebody coming in and presenting this story in an exciting way, with also the public being ready to hear it, um, helping guys who had been fighting for a very long time and been pushing for a very long time, and sort of like helping to build that critical mass so that when the spark came, it was ready.
Now, I come at this from a medical provider, Dupree Hospital. My full-time job is emergency room nurse. What do you hope non-medical people, when they read this book, what are you hoping that they take away from this?
I mean, this story, all the different aspects of it, to me, never felt so much like medical history or Black history, but simply American history. And I think when you read this, what you see is that everything is a collective effort. You know, does Freedom House become Freedom House without Peter Safar? No. Does Peter Safar's idea become Freedom House, the people up the hill? No. But they come together and they create this incredible thing. People from different worlds with a collective goal, and understanding that, hey, all we need to do, get where we want to be, is to pull on the same oar. And that's what they did. And they changed our lives forever. Even if we didn't know it, how Americans live and die, don't they, is because of this organization that exists for barely a decade in a city that many of us have never visited. Uh, but who did an incredible thing.
What is one question that you wish more people would ask about this particular book?
Probably why did it take so long? This story had been around since before I was born. This predates me. I was not around in '77. So it was a woman I was speaking to. She was a widow of one of the medics. She said, "My husband died without his kids really knowing what he did." And I just felt like, God, how terrible. It's like wonderful that I'm able to help now. But what a thing to have done this, the world to basically, it's not like the world shrugged. The world embraced it. They just didn't embrace them. So, I think the good question is like, why? Why did it take so long? Because I think we're very quick to try to like push all this stuff aside and say, I mean, that was a long time ago. You know, like people get angry about it. Identity politics, or like you're just trying to divide us when you bring all these things up. And how's it helpful? Let me think something. People living in that neighborhood, like, how do they move on if we never acknowledge what happened to them and never like truly praise them for what they did? Like, how do they move on? And then how do we expect them to look at us and embrace us fully as the complicated and wonderful people that we are? If we're not willing to do the same with them. So, I think we've got to look at ourselves. Like we're sort of in the moment. Our government is kind of trying to sanitize various aspects of history. How is that helpful? How do any of us benefit from having a simpler, truthful depiction of who, what, where of all of us? Like it makes no sense.
All right, last question about American Sirens, and then we're going to move on to your newest book.
Yeah.
When is the screenplay, and who plays Dr. Safar, and who plays John Moon?
So I'm writing the script now. So we'll see. Yeah, man. So, I always wanted Michael B. Jordan to be John, or Mitch perhaps. I think that would be great. And then, like if Christoph Waltz would be the perfect Peter Safar, like I don't know who would be, like he's so great. Or even like I could see, because Safar was like the most like hyperkinetic personality ever. I can see Sam Rockwell because he plays such a lunatic so well.
And then older John Moon, Denzel.
Well, yeah, look, Denzel. It's always Denzel.
I mean, he's not bad in anything.
He is not. The answer to every question.
Oh, he'd be so good in that role. All right, let's move on to your new book, No One's Coming. I've only read the jacket cover. I don't know anything else other than what I've read there. Tell us a little bit about what this book is about and what prompted you to write this.
So in the summer of 2014, a guy by the name of Dent Thompson gets a phone call from the U.S. State Department. And the guy on the other end of the line says, some Americans, we're not sure how many, are in West Africa. We're not exactly sure where, but they're dying of Ebola. And we have tried, and no one else on earth is able or willing to come to their rescue. So you're their last hope. Will you do this? Will you fly into the midst of what is rapidly becoming the deadliest Ebola outbreak in human history and rescue these two, was ultimately two, but and rescue these Americans? And so the book is about the 10 days following that phone call, in which this tremendous rescue was pulled off. But also, who the hell is Dent Thompson? And why is he getting this phone?
I was a nursing student when that Ebola outbreak happened. And so that was a great educational opportunity for us as we were going on to units. Of course, it wasn't here, but I remember that story and remember that, there was this big concern and everybody was on high alert. And I just remember thinking how terrible that must be, one, to be trying to take care of people. And then that becomes your fate. And then years later, as I am, halfway through my career, I was like 4 years into my nursing career when COVID hit. And then I got to live that experience where I come into work and I have 4 patients, all of them are COVID positive. And then I'm trying to decide, like, am I going to bring this home to my family? So I can't imagine the mindset of the people that agreed to do this, because Ebola was, if you contracted that, there's that part of you that thinks this is it. Like there is probably not a good chance of me coming through this. And so to agree to go get those people, I can't even imagine the mental fortitude it would take to make that decision.
The mortality rate during the West African Ebola outbreak was somewhere between 70 and 90%. Ebola had been discovered in 76. but it had always appeared in very remote places. Most of its patients died very quickly. There wasn't a great understanding of how to treat it or what it looks like actively in a human body. So we didn't know a lot. We didn't really know how to treat it. Suddenly you have thousands of people, 3 different countries, all with big metropolitan areas, dying horrible deaths. The world is essentially not looking, not taking part. Three nations are crumbling before our very eyes, and the world is allowing 2 volunteer organizations to be the entirety of the global response to this. And in Liberia, there were about a dozen foreigners who were there, and a very small sort of a contingent of local nurses and doctors. You know, they were completely overrun. They were not prepared for this. None of them had ever been around Ebola. They didn't have an Ebola treatment center. They had to sort of make one. So the people in the U.S. are flocking into this to try to rescue these Americans. And of course, the reason that this becomes so important is these countries are totally overwhelmed by the outbreak, and their own medical systems are collapsing. So that you need, in a situation like that, you need the global community to help. And if the people who are showing help down, they're not going to keep showing. And so you had to prove, hey, like, we need your help. If something goes wrong while you're here, we'll get you home. So at bare minimum, you can die at home with your family. And so that becomes the imperative for these guys as they're trying to rescue them. And yeah, there's a great moment in the book where there's a nurse by the name of John Jackson, long-term ICU nurse. He's exactly what you would expect. He worked at Erlanger. He just has that sort of hard-bitten, like really, like super competent, but also like really sort of like sarcastic, like exactly what you expect from a guy who's been in the field for a long time. And he said to me, he said, 5 seconds before I found out we were doing Ebola transports. And this is a guy who works for service that flies all over the world in combat zones, picks up crazy situations, flying all across the world with critically ill patients with a lot of drips and monitors and like really difficult long range medicine in jet where it's just you and a doctor. There's no one else. He said that 5 seconds before they told me we were transporting Ebola, if somebody had said, "What are you guys?" I said, "We're badass nurses who can do anything." And he said, "In the moment I found out we were doing Ebola, my first thought was, I need to go home and talk to my wife." And each of these people involved really had to weigh, okay, this is what I believe in. This is what I've always said I want. But now, in a very dramatic way, being forced to confront that. I'm going to be in a plane with experimental technology for 14 hours on an international flight with one of the scariest, least understood, contagious viruses we've ever known. How do I really feel about that? How willing am I to put my money where my mouth is and walk the talk that I've been giving for so long? But they all do it. There's a nurse, there's 2 nurses who run both those transports, and 2 separate doctors. And for them to do what they did is just remarkable heroism.
Yeah. Well, now I got to buy the book.
Yeah, you do.
Speaking of which, I'm going to buy anyway. But speaking of which, where is the best place to get your books? Like, and I always like to ask, what is the best place for us to get them that would benefit the author?
Sure. Look, I love booksellers, man. They're great. They're a great breed of humans. So I always say, if there's a book in your area, if a bookstore in your area, like, go there and pick it up there. They're really good people. But we also live in a different world. So you can get it at Barnes and Noble. You can get it at Amazon. There's a Kindle version. There's an audio version. So essentially, anywhere that you can book, no one's coming as a.
We have a local bookshop here, which I love. I'm grateful they've been in business for 5 years now, and I'm willing to wait the extra time. I'll just go to them and say, "This is the book I want. Can you order it for me?" and then just tell me when it's here and I'll come get it. And I love that about them. And they're great. They always give me great. I've gotten so many books that I never would have discovered without them. So yes, I love the local booksellers, support them. Amazon's great, but there's something about going to an old style bookstore and just going through the racks and looking and seeing something new.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, two things. One, your local bookseller is never going to try to find a space with a wiener shaped rocket. And they're also not actively trying to destroy your world. So I think it's just it's a no brainer.
And then lastly, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. You can find me there if you search for that name, and I'm trying to keep updates on the book. I've been a little out of touch recently because I'm just finishing up nursing school, which has been a crazy stretch, and just trying to get back into the world now that I finished literally this week. This is my last couple of days.
I didn't know you were in nursing school. That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah, man. Yeah, thank you. It's
like writing books and screenplays and TV, that wasn't enough. And they had to subject yourself to nursing school.
I have a war on sleep.
Well, I think you're winning. You're winning that war.
Back during the pandemic, I started working with an international relief organization. A lot of the people involved, medicine's like the military. The military is run by sergeants. Medicine is run by nurses. I was around a lot of nurses, and one of my friends who's in Gaza right now, saying like, "Hey man, like you have an undergrad and you have all this medical experience. Go through an ABSN program and get out here and do some stuff." And so I did. It took me a little while to kind of get everything, and get myself in order. But yeah, I've been doing that for the last year, and it's been a crazy experience. It was, it's as horrible as everybody says it is, but now that I'm through, I'm excited.
Wait till you take the NCLEX.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that at all. I'm trying to not think about that, but I've got a job lined up in Children's Healthcare of Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
And so it's funny, I had two offers and I was really struggling with them because one was in the ER and my experience is emergency medicine. And another was in specialized cardiac unit that does LVADs and transplants and all that kind of stuff. And I just going back and forth. And finally I was like, look, I know I like emergency. I don't know anything about this. If I like this, it's great paying, but if I don't, I guess I can move, I can go back to sort of the emergency world, but let me see how I will do, in sort of an environment where it's just me and two patients with, a lot going on, as opposed to, the always hop in emergency department kind of vibe. So I'm curious to see how it's going to go. I'm uncertain. I'm a little anxious. There's definitely a voice in the back of my head that was like, "You idiot! You should have just gone to emergency." But I'm excited. I'm interested to see how it goes, and of course, I'll still be writing. So I mean, it's always going to be madness.
Well, I expect 10 years in nursing, and then we'll get a new book.
Hopefully faster.
No, that's great. I have a special place in my heart for a lot of specialties. So psych, pediatric. I did a stint in peds ER at the University of Virginia, and I have a whole new respect for, skill wise, I can do it. I know how to do the things. The emotional side of it, being a dad with young kids, that part for me was the struggle. And I don't know how those nurses do that on a daily basis. The same I can say for hospice nursing, how they deal with that on a daily basis. But I am so grateful there are nurses that can do that. My comfort zone is the emergency room and adult emergency room and then ICU. And they look at me and they go, "I don't know how you do that." So I'm grateful that there are nurses that can be spread around and do all the different jobs. So I'm very excited for you. And I wish you all the best on the NCLEX as well. So any closing remarks, any closing thoughts as we step out?
I don't know. We covered so much, man, but look, this story, the new book, we're living in kind of a funny time, and between wood chippering, of USAID, demonization of CDC, of public health. I think in many instances of public health or healthcare workers, I look at this story and, you have these two people, one's a doctor, one's a volunteer, who traveled halfway across the world and risked their lives for strangers, then became sick. And in turn, another group of strangers risked their lives to save them. And, we're living in a place right now, in a time right now, where the knee-jerk reaction to, hey, will you help, is, yeah, but what's in it for me? And how much of an inconvenience is this going to be for me? I mean, if you look back to the pandemic, people, the whole wearing a mask thing, you weren't being asked to sacrifice, you were being asked to inconvenience yourself. In 1980, if you had surgery, long before any of this was political, your surgeon would have worn a surgical mask, because that surgeon would have known surgical mask would reduce the amount of airborne particulate, thereby reducing the chances of me getting you sick. It's quite simple. It isn't a political thing, but we're kind of in a funny place where it's like, I'm not sure I want to even inconvenience myself for the greater good. And here are people of many different political backgrounds who were willing to risk their lives for the greater good. I think that's just something we need to remind ourselves on, especially, and in medicine, it's what we do. That is the mandate. That is what we, I know when it comes to the military, we talk about people join out of the sense of service. I would argue the same thing for medicine. In my time on an ambulance, forget the, police and shootings and all that kind of madness. You crawl across a bed for this 87-year-old woman, a C. diff, and has wedged herself against the wall, and man, this is so stupid, but what am I going to do? She's there, and I'm here, and I'm doing the help. That is the job. That is a sense of service. That's what draws us to this. Nobody wants to get sick. But, we are stepping into these situations because we're called to, we're drawn to it. That's just something that we can't live without. I mean, I can tell you, as someone who spent the last decade writing, I missed it. Sitting on studio lots as television and movies were being produced, and living a version of my dream. There was a part of me that was like, yeah, but what about that other thing? How was that part of your soul being served? And it wasn't. So this job that we do, I mean, it's so incredibly important, not only to us, but to society as a whole. And it's sort of under attack right now. We need to be pushing back.
Agreed. And we look forward to welcoming you to the ranks of the registered nurses. So look forward to seeing that post when you pass your NCLEX and you start your new job. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. This is one of the most anticipated interviews that I have done in a long time, just because I'm a big fan of the books, and I look forward to reading your new book. And again, thank you so much for your time. I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Gary. I appreciate it, man, very much.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Call Light with Gary Cope. Don't forget to clock out.